Here with Bill Laboon, Director of Education and Governance Initiatives at Web3 Foundation. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us today, and my pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yes, obviously, all the talk during this time is Bitcoin hitting all-time highs. We were in a crypto winter for what felt like an eternity, I guess, and we are out of that. Leading up to sort of these record runs in Bitcoin, the Bitcoin halving event, has been spoken of quite a lot, because we've seen what happens during past halving events as well, in terms of what that does to circulation and what that does to Bitcoin price as well. So just for the people who are uninitiated with, they aren't that familiar with what happens in the halving process, could you just explain a bit about the halving process, and when is it expected to take place?
Sure. So the idea of Bitcoin is that the production of Bitcoin is programmatically determined, and has been since Bitcoin was started in 2009. So what you have is every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that is produced goes in half, thus the halving or the halvening. So when Bitcoin first started, every block that was produced produced 50 Bitcoin. After 4 years in 2012, that went down to 25. We are currently at 6.25. So at the next halving, which should occur sometime on April 17th, about a month away from now, blocks will then generate 3.125 Bitcoin. So basically, every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that is produced per day is cut in half.
Yeah, just to elaborate a bit on that, this rewards that you're speaking about, the Bitcoin rewards, of course, go to the miners responsible for sort of the plumbing of the Bitcoin network in terms of validating, verifying transactions. So their rewards is what really gets cut in half, the rewards for these miners who are mining each block.
Correct. So all Bitcoin are produced by miners as a side effect of securing the network and continuing the network. As you said, the plumbing of the network, producing more blocks in the blockchain. They get rewarded by producing what's called the coin base, essentially like this extra amount of Bitcoin. This is where all Bitcoin come from. There's no external entity that can create Bitcoin. The only way to make Bitcoin is by producing blocks for the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, and I suppose that's what lead us on to speak about the scarcity of Bitcoin as well, which we'll delve into a bit later. Without going too much into the weeds, can you speak about why exactly this mechanism is there in the first place? I mean, for anyone looking at this sort of technology, wondering, why exactly do we have this sort of halvening of the blocks that are minted every 4 years?
Yeah, so just as background, there are lots of other blockchains and cryptocurrencies that use different mechanisms than a halvening. So the reason for Bitcoin was essentially, especially as the very first blockchain, really the first modern blockchain, to get more Bitcoin out in circulation. At first, there were many more Bitcoin produced, but over time, this was less necessary. And one of the key points of Bitcoin is that there is not only a finite supply; they are not infinitely produced. There is a certain number that will always be produced, but also that this number and the release and issuance of Bitcoin is programmatically determined. So, whenever you start up a new project, right, you want to get a lot of the tokens, of the coins out into the hands of people. And as time goes on, that's less and less necessary. There's already a lot of coins out there. They have been spread around. But when you first start up a project, you need to get it in the hands of as many people as possible. So if you look at the issuance of Bitcoin, since it does have halvenings, it sort of goes down like this over time. As more people are already involved in the network, there's less need to, for lack of a better word, seed the network of Bitcoin users. But when a network first starts up, that's essential.
You mentioned the downward sloping curve of how many Bitcoins are issued. I mean, if you do look at a chart of when, of 2009 towards, 2023, 24 to where we are now, and you see what has sort of happened to issuance, you can see it sort of leveling out. So just two questions on that. I mean, but how many Bitcoins have been minted already? And the second question to that, how does supply growth look like? Because from what you're mentioning, this downward issuance, of course, now I've seen other people in the industry remark that supply of Bitcoin might drop towards a 1%, the supply growth of Bitcoin, to be more accurate, for the first time actually.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So obviously, when the network first started, issuance, inflation was essentially infinite. At the first halving in 2012, annual inflation was approximately 25%, which went down to 12.5% after the halving. Currently, we're slightly under 2%. It's about 1.7%, and that will be reduced to a bit under 1%. So again, this will be the first time in Bitcoin history we have less than 1% inflation on Bitcoin. This series of halvenings actually will end, and Bitcoin issuance will end in 2140. So that's still quite a ways in the future. But to answer your first question, we've actually mined almost 94%. So about at the halvening, it will be exactly 93.75%. We're not quite there yet, so let's say 93.5%. You can see the vast majority of Bitcoin has already been mined. So miners going forward are going to be, in terms of issuance, are fighting for a much smaller issuance of Bitcoin in every block.
Yeah, that leads me on to my next question. I mean, if we have got this finite supply, and you mentioned we're not quite there yet. I mean, we've still got some years to go, let's just say.
Yeah.
What happens after you have this sort of 21 million Bitcoin minted? What happens after that?
So the network can continue. There simply will be no more issuance. However, you may ask yourself, since we just said, the benefit of the miners, right? The reason the miners are doing it is they are getting Bitcoin. However, there are actually two ways that miners can be are paid essentially for their work. The first is this Coinbase, this issuance of new Bitcoin, which will go away. But the second is fees for people using the network. And generally, this Coinbase, this new issuance of Bitcoin, has always been much higher than the fees that people use for it. And the idea, from the very early days, was that eventually you would only need fees in order to keep the network secure and provide enough payment in Bitcoin to the miners, to keep the network going. We've actually seen over the last year or so, there have been other uses of the Bitcoin network besides just transferring Bitcoin around. So probably most famously ordinals, but there are a few other things as well that people are using Bitcoin for besides Bitcoin, the coin itself. And these have actually led to quite a few times where the fee rewards are much larger or definitely larger than the issuance of new Bitcoin. So essentially, as time goes on, what has been sort of seen and what was sort of predicted and what we've actually seen is that this fee market is going to take over from new issuance of Bitcoin in order to ensure that miners are still are paid to do the work of continuing and securing the network.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point actually, because most people, when they think about miners, on the Bitcoin network, they're thinking about the block rewards that miners get paid. But of course, you're saying that as we find new uses for Bitcoin, new use cases, then the fees are what's still going to be attracting the miners to do the work that's essential for the blockchain system.
Exactly. But we still have quite a bit of time before I think that would be definitely necessary. There still is going to be 3.125 Bitcoin produced for the next 4 years, and then 1.6-ish for the next 4 years after that. So this new issuance is probably still going to be a major part of how miners make money in the near future. But we have also been finding lots of new ways to work with a trustless ledger and use it for other things rather than just sending Bitcoin around, which is that's important. But we also see Bitcoin L2s being produced. We see document verification. We see inscriptions, people using NFTs on Bitcoin. And so the more things we see people using Bitcoin for, every time someone does that, that's a fee that they're going to pay. So we can see like a very bright future for miners in the long run, that they will still have the ability to mine Bitcoin, even if the the Bitcoin that's being issued isn't a major part of their how they're receiving funds.
Yeah, great. I mean, you touched on a few things that are quite interesting. One of them is some of the use cases. Now in 2024, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of some of the emerging use cases of Bitcoin that necessarily wasn't around, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when Bitcoin was still nascent?
I think that the big thing over the last year has definitely been the rise of inscriptions. So that's putting data directly on the Bitcoin network that will be stored by all the nodes. So this can be like very like silly things. Like I put a funny picture of myself on Bitcoin and I paid the fees for that. Just knowing that funny picture of me will always be there. I've written a love note to my wife on Bitcoin. It's very romantic. And from this, actually, there's the idea of ordinals. So ordinals are essentially like super NFTs on Bitcoin that the image is actually stored on chain and can be transferred to others. So there's been these have been very big over the last year, and in the more recent past, over the last few months, really, although some of these have been going on for a while. We've seen L2s. So these are just like L2s on Ethereum. They're essentially a way of using the security of Bitcoin to do other things, to have more complicated, more complicated processes, more complicated programs running on top of it with the security of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is an incredibly secure network. Trying to hack it would be extremely difficult. And so I think it's really interesting. I think this is actually a very big area for growth as we see more of these L2s being built on top of Bitcoin, where people can run more complicated programs, things that were done sometimes on other blockchains, and some things that can be very specific to Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's another interesting point because for a while it's always been okay, Bitcoin is the store of value, but when you look at another sort of blockchain technology or blockchain layer like Ethereum, that's the one that you can build more because it's got more flexibility, it's got the smart contracts. But from what I understand that you're saying is that now you've got some of these L2 layers that are helping Bitcoin develop more than it was previously.
Yeah, exactly. So when we look at the history of blockchain, we saw Ethereum as like the first, really truly, all-purpose blockchain. And then we've seen a lot of other blockchains being built, like including Polkadot, the project that we work on at Web3 Foundation, that can do more things, do it in different ways, have different trade-offs, but for Bitcoin itself, it's very difficult to program on. It's been very secure. Part of that security is because it's very simple. It's very straightforward. Whereas other chains can be more complicated. There's more you can do, but it's also more complicated. So with the growth of these Bitcoin L2s, what we're seeing is sort of different trade-offs being made, where people that want something that is very secure, they have that groundwork of Bitcoin, but they can then do things that are more complicated, like you could do on some of these other chains. Now there are some different technical trade-offs, especially involving the speed of Bitcoin, but in terms of the actual code, they can do very similar things.
Yeah, just a final point on that. We've seen a massive development, I guess, in the last 3 months, which was sort of the Bitcoin spot ETF that everyone was waiting for. Now, that has sort of legitimized Bitcoin, even though it was legitimized by, I guess, in the perspective of institutional investors, Wall Street, etc., that has sort of legitimized Bitcoin as an asset class. And now we've seen what we see now in terms of record inflows and institutionals getting involved in Bitcoin, which it seems like everyone was waiting for all of these big players to get involved in Bitcoin. How do you think that's going to affect sort of, how do you think that's going to affect Bitcoin, from the development side? Because you mentioned that we've got these LT layers with all this new sort of investment and euphoria coming into Bitcoin. How do you think that's going to impact it going forward?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm definitely coming at this from a very technical angle. That's really my focus.
Yeah.
But one of the things that that I have seen, right, and experienced is this does a couple of things. One, it brings a lot more excitement, not just to Bitcoin, but also to really all blockchain technology, right? There's a lot more news about it. There's news in traditional finance media. There's news in other media. The Bitcoin ETF was something that was not just in the crypto circles, but really all over. And I think that as well as the sort of, as you mentioned, normalization, right? Or approval, right? That's sort of showing like a stamp of approval that yes, Bitcoin is here to stay. This is a real solid project and a real paradigm shift, if you'll excuse the cliche, right? That is actually worth building on. And so I have seen a lot of energy recently because of this. I think that because there's more news about it, there's more people discussing it. That also means that developers are interested in building on it. It's just like anything else. When you hear things, when it's in the news, you think not just like, okay, this is something that I can build on, it's real, but also inspires people to have ideas. They start thinking about it more. And so we're already starting to see, I think, some of the results of this, not just new developers coming in that can code, but also people thinking, or what else can I do with Bitcoin? What else can I do with blockchain technology? What else can I do to decentralize things, and realize that this is sort of a valid path forward.
Yeah. As a last point, I mean, over the years, Bitcoin has been criticized because of the energy usage, but we've seen a lot of effort, a lot of investment go into sort of using clean energy when it comes to sort of mining Bitcoins, and that doesn't seem to be spoken about as much as before, or with such a bigger criticism as it was. Can you speak a little bit about how that has evolved as well?
Sure. There's also not just using green energy for Bitcoin, but also using wasted energy, for Bitcoin, which actually can make it more economically efficient to generate energy from other areas. So I think here in Switzerland, for instance, we have a lot of dams, for hydropower, and during the night, dams will just produce power essentially, on an ongoing, continuous basis. And so at night, what they do is they pump the water up to the top of a hill using the extra electricity that's not being used by the households, and then they can let it come down, to have more electricity later. That's one thing you could do with hydropower, but things like, for instance, natural gas or coal plants, some of these other plants, there's a lot of wasted energy that it's wasted. It just gets vented, or just it's wasted. And so Bitcoin, this is going to be the cheapest form of energy, right? There's some places you can actually be paid to use electricity for something. So I think what we're going to see is that this is where Bitcoin mining is going to take place more and more, because it's the most efficient, and it actually might be very useful for those that are building green energy. So hydropower is one example. Like wave power, a lot of these are very consistent no matter what. And so in order to subsidize them, you can mine Bitcoin with this extra electricity, and it'll be very, very efficient. So I think we've seen a lot more focus paid to this in terms of Bitcoin. I also want to mention that this is specifically Bitcoin. Very few other blockchains nowadays actually use proof of work. What we say, this large amounts of electricity. There are a lot of other more energy efficient ways to secure blockchains than proof of work. And again, all of them have their own trade-offs. But blockchain technology, I want to emphasize, is not synonymous with the usage of large amounts of electricity.
Yeah, I think that's great, Bill. I think we can end it on that note. So thanks again for your time. That was Bill Laboon, Director of Education and Governance Initiatives at Web3 Foundation.